All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Friday class. Today we've got a quiz and we are going to continue talking about the skull. So our agenda looks like this. We're going to start off, do the quiz first. It's in class on paper. Then I've got a short human anatomy in the news for you today. Then we'll continue with the skull. I probably won't get to too much today with the quiz, but that's okay. We'll pick it up on Monday. And then as always, I have our Friday Venn diagram and some reminders on your way out. So before we get into it, any questions? Alex? No, the quiz is only on joints and muscles. Good question. Other questions? Any questions on the content for the quiz before we get into it? All right, so it's closed book. You've got 20 minutes here in class. And I reached out and got a personalized message of encouragement for the class from my dear friend, Missy Elliott. She said, "You got this. You do well. If anything is unclear, you have any questions, let me know." Sound okay? All right, let's do it.
You were very excited to have a full class on this.
I know. I saw the video. Well, I'm glad you're watching the video. I'm putting your hand up. We missed you. We did miss you terribly, though.
I bet you did.
Okay, you've got about a minute left. All right, I'm gonna come around and collect these now. Go ahead and take a minute or two stretch break here. You just finished the quiz. Shake out your hands, stand up, move around for a second. Give yourself a chance to transition back to the world. These will take a minute for me to grade, but I'll try to get them back to you as soon as I can, of course. Any questions on it? We can talk freely about it now.
I've seen that diagram so many times and I cannot remember a thing on it.
Oh no. Hopefully you got the synovial fluid one.
Oh, yeah.
That one. Okay.
I got that one.
That was
I
yeah.
don't remember exactly where in my notes I have that diagram. I do not remember.
I tried to make it have some clues in that I left some of the labels on there. I was hoping that was a helpful guide in kind of process of elimination anyway. Cool. All right. Well, let's continue with our skull then. We still have a good part of class left here, and we'll keep moving forward with this. We obviously won't finish the skull today. We'll probably finish it up on Monday next week, I would expect. See you, Zoe. All right, so first I have human anatomy in the news. This is kind of a funny story that came out, I think it's about a year and a half ago now. And there's a headline in newspapers. And I actually think this is, don't quote me on this, but I think this is from the Washington Post. It's like a big name, reputable news source with a headline of this: horns are growing on young people's skulls. Phone is to blame, research suggests. Now take a second. When you read that headline, what do you picture? Does someone want, yeah, horns, right? Like when you see the word horns, it makes you think of like goats or I don't know what else has a unicorn.
Those implants, where it's like little knobs.
Yes, yes. It makes you think of that, right? And so this is a good example. What I like about this, we're going to learn a little bit about human anatomy from this example, but also on like reading and being scientifically literate on the news. A counter headline is this: no, we're probably not growing horns because of our cell phone use. One of the authors of that study sells posture pillows. So a study came out, and some of the popular media read this study, and they produced headlines like this. Other media sources produce headlines like this. Here is what the study actually was about. It was from a journal called Scientific Reports, which is generally a fair, fine, reputable journal. And you can see the title of the paper here: prominent exostosis projecting from the occipital squama, more substantial and prevalent in young adult than older age groups. So kind of obscure academic language here. And what they found, this is an image from the paper itself. They found that there was these protuberances in the posterior inferior region of the skull, so on your occipital bone right here. You can see this one is 27 millimeters, so that's an inch, right? That's a fairly decent size protuberance. If we blow that up in detail, you can see what that looks like here. So just to orient you, this is an X-ray, it's a radiograph looking at a lateral view of the human skull here. So here's the occipital bone, which we're going to cover today, the most inferior bone of the skull, and then here's the spinal, the spinal column. And what these little protuberances are called they are called enthesophytes. It's a bony spur forming at a ligament or tendon insertion into bone, growing in the direction of the natural pull of the ligament or tendon involved. So this is a good term to know. Again and again in this class, I've emphasized how bone is dynamic tissue that responds to the stresses put on it. Well, this is an example of that. Basically, you have this, in this case, this ligament that attaches here to the bone. That ligament is under a lot of stress, and the bone responds by producing this outgrowth, right? And this study found that some people have these little outgrowths, some people don't, but they were more prominent in folks that were between the ages of 18 and 30. And that's it, right? They found that there were slightly more of these in younger folks in younger adults than older adults. And then you get headlines like this, that cell phone use is to blame, right? So they completely conjectured that like, hey, we found this more in young people. It must be those dang kids and their cell phones. Like literally, that was their interpretation, that without any evidence, without any records of cell phone usage or anything like that, they're like, oh, those youngsters are standing with their heads down looking at their phones, and that's going to make these bones grow larger. Furthermore, the study, one of the co-authors of the study is involved with a business selling pillows to improve posture. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the study is bunk or anything like that. However, this information wasn't disclosed when they published the paper, which is a huge problem. If there's any kind of potential conflict of interest like that, authors are required to state that up front and say, hey, I did this study on bone development, and I also am involved with the company that sells pillows. Generally, as long as people know that, they can then judge the validity of the study on their own. But with this particular study, they never reported that, so that's problematic as well. So the takeaway message here is that bone is dynamic, and you can produce these enthesophytes because of the tension produced by tendons or ligaments pulling on bone. And then also thinking about scientific research and how it's presented, is we need to make sure that the conclusions that researchers are drawing are actually founded on their data. And in this case, linking this to cell phone use is just kind of absurd. But then when they make kind of a marginal claim like that in their study, then the popular press comes back and they're like, oh yeah, this is the headline that they produce. So always be a little bit weary of these kind of extreme headlines if you see them in the news. Did anyone see this when it came out in the news? It was like marginally large story for like 12 hours, as news seems to be. Cool. So let's go back to our skull. This is a diagram that you saw last time in class. And these occipital protuberances that they're measuring are down here in this region of the occipital bone. So I think it might have been actually like, this would be an example of a very mild one of those enthesophytes that they studied. Remember, for these slides, I have a study guide available if you want to pull that up if you didn't last class. It's just a set of Google slides with these diagrams so that you can use those as references as we're working through and don't have to draw a whole bunch of pictures, although I'd encourage you to draw those pictures as you study. Cool. Okay, so we last talked about dividing the skull into two sets of bones. We have your cranial bones or calvaria, of which there's 8. And then we also have your facial bones, of which there's a whole bunch, 14, I think. I'll have to double check that, but a lot more, right? And they're more complicated. When we started talking about the cranial bones, we talked about the parietal bone, the frontal bone, and that's about all we got to. And so now I want to continue that, talking about the occipital bone, which is this large bone here on the posterior and inferior aspect of the skull. And so the occipital bone forms the posterior portion, as I mentioned, in the cranial base, and it includes sutures with the parietal bones, and so that's your lambdoid sutures, and the temporal bones, which are the occipitomastoid sutures. And I'm going to show you a diagram of that, actually. Oops, sorry. So going back to this diagram, the lambdoid suture is here between the occipital and parietal bones. And remember, that's that kind of inverted V-shaped suture. So we're seeing one side of it from the lateral view. And then we have the suture between the occipital bone and the temporal bone that runs across there. And that is your occipitomastoid suture. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing there. My bad. I was getting ahead of myself. I'm looking at this suture. This is the suture between the parietal and the temporal bone. Sorry, didn't mean to confuse you. The suture on the occipitomastoid suture is this suture right here between the occipital bone and the temporal bone. Sorry, I said the wrong thing there. I was getting ahead of myself. It's called occipitomastoid because we have the occipital bone, and then the mastoid process is this little bony protuberance that's part of the temporal bone. And the suture is kind of right along that mastoid process. The mastoid process I'll talk about in a second, but it's this bony thing right behind your ear that you feel with your finger. So the occipital bone is important because it articulates with the atlas. Remember, the atlas is, what's another name for the atlas? C1 vertebrae, good. And we talked about the joint between the occipital bone and the atlas being your yes joint. So this is the joint that allows you to nod your head yes. And that happens on these features called the occipital condyles that are part of the atlas where the occipital bone articulates. The other big feature on the occipital bone is the foramen magnum, which literally translates as big hole. This is the hole through which your spinal cord passes to attach to your brain. Internally, the base of the occipital bone forms your posterior cranial fossa. So remember, early on, we talked about the skull. We looked at the 3 fossa, the anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa where the brain rests. The occipital bone forms that posterior one in the back. And I'm going to show you all of this on a diagram in a second. Actually, let me just skip ahead here to a diagram here. I'm going to go back to those notes, but I just want to show you the diagram. So this is looking at the skull from the inferior view. So looking down, looking up into the skull. You can see the occipital condyles here. That's where it articulates with the atlas, C1. And then the foramen magnum is this big hole right here through which your spinal cord passes. Then other features include the hypoglossal foramen, which is a foramen through which one of your cranial nerves passes. You have something called your external occipital protuberance and then superior and inferior nuchal lines. So let me show you what those look like. So this is your occipital bone from the posterior view. You can see the occipital condyle down here. And you have a couple important features here from the back. You have this external occipital crest, which is this bony protuberance, this kind of ridge that runs right down the middle of that occipital bone. And then you have your superior and inferior nuchal lines here. In this structure, these protuberances are where a ligament, an important ligament called the ligamentum nuchae, connects. And so you can feel this in your head. If you move your head back and you can feel this protuberance in your occipital bone there. And if you lean your head forward, you can feel ligaments in your neck stretching and that attach to those protuberances. This ligament is weirdly important for one thing that humans are really good at, other than sweating, the other thing we're really good at. What do you think that ligament is important? It's not really obvious. Take a good guess. What do us humans do that makes us kind of unique? Not entirely unique, but one of our strong suits as a species. Seeing lots of quizzical looks here because it's not obvious at all. This ligament, I'll just explain. The ligamentum nuchae is really important for running. And the reason it's important for running is because in running, you're constantly moving up and down, and you are producing a lot of stresses on your head and neck as you bob, right? This ligament keeps our head in place when we run, so our heads don't flop all over the place. And so what's kind of cool is that other mammals that have evolved for high running capacity have this ligament. So for example, horses have this ligament because they keep their heads really steady as they run. Other animals don't. So if you've ever seen a pig run, their heads wobble all over the place because they don't have this feature. They haven't evolved for high running capacity. And so they don't have this ligamentum nuchae and their heads move around. Let me see if I can find a video real quick because it'd be kind of fun to see an example of that. Let's see. Yeah, I'll take some time and I'll see if I can incorporate one in the next lecture just as a demonstration. So yeah, for sure. This one? Yep. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me actually show you the diagram here. So this is the posterior view. You have the occipital condyles on either side of the foramen magnum. And if you look at that from the inferior view, you can see the two condyles right there. Remember, a condyle is like a flat surface of a bone where it articulates with another bone. So you saw a condyle, for example, in the distal end of your femur, where it articulates with your patella, another condyle. Does that answer your question, Gia? Good. So you should know this diagram, all of the features on the occipital bone labeled here. I also include in this diagram the occipitomastoid suture, again, between the temporal and occipital bones. And you can see the lambdoid suture again. Just as a quick reminder from last class, what do we call these little guys? Sutural bones. Yep. And some of us have them, some of us don't. Probably none of you know if you do or not, I'm guessing. I don't know if I have them or not. Kylie, question. Yeah, of course. This one? Yeah, I don't think I included the text slides in the slides I gave you, just the diagrams. And I think thinking forward, and maybe this is helpful for me to stay out loud as you study, I wish I had actually integrated this text on the slide with the figure and kind of pointed to the things I was talking about. I kind of have it set up as two separate things right now, but I think that's not the best way to present this information. I'm saying that for myself because next time I teach the class, I can improve my slides. But for you, as you study, it might be useful to like overlay this text next to the diagram and make sure you can draw lines between the features I mentioned here in the diagram. So we've got this diagram of the occipital bone from posterior view, and then we have it from the inferior view. Just looking at this. Yeah, and this has some of the same features that you saw from the posterior view, but from the inferior view, you can see the inferior and superior nuchal lines. the external occipital protuberance, which you can feel right here in the back of your head. And then the foramen magnum as well. I have the basilar part of the occipital bone labeled here. Probably won't ask you about that, but you can note that there. That's our occipital bone. Ready for the temporal bone? Boom. Okay. So the temporal bone, temporal comes from the word for time. And it's thought that it's called this because this is where gray hairs kind of are first become prominent on a lot of people. And so it's right over, these gray hairs are right over this part of the skull. And so we call this the temporal bone. I think that's a weird way to name it. I don't name this stuff. The temporal bones are inferior to your parietal bones, and they form the inferolateral portion of the skull. So basically the lower sides of your skull. And they're important because it's kind of the central cranial bone, and it also forms part of both the posterior and the middle cranial fossa. So I'll talk about these structures in a second. I just want to go back and orient you to where this bone is generally. This is temporal bone. It's really weird shape. It has this big flat area. It has this kind of thick area back here. You've got your ear canal passes through it, and you've got this process right here, and you've got this little really thin little process right down there. So it's one of the most, I would argue it's probably the most irregular shaped bone potentially in the whole body. It's really funky. So we're going to learn about the different aspects of it and what they do. Let me just skip ahead here. So I mentioned it's a complex bone, and there's three main parts of the bone. There's the squamous portion, the styloid portion, and the petrous portion. And I'll talk about each of those on the next slide. I'll show you where they are. I have here how these different features of the bone are derived from different embryonic tissues. So different bones derive from different embryonic tissues. You don't need to know that. I'm not going to ask you those questions. In a previous iteration of the class, I got into more detail with that. The takeaway message here is that early in development, these different bone structures come together and fuse to make your temporal bone, which is kind of why it's so funky shaped. So you will need to know those three parts, the squamous, styloid, and petrous. And let me show you those on a diagram here. So we have the squamous part is this big flat region right here. Squamous means flat, like your epithelial cells in the squamous cell. Then you have the tympanic part, which is the part that surrounds the ear canal. Then you have this petrous part, which is this part back here. And the word petrous comes from the word for rock because it is this kind of bigger, thicker part of the bone. The squamous is big and flat, but it gets thicker back here. You'll see this in lab when you have examples of this. So we have those three parts of the bone, of the temporal bone. A couple other features that are important is your zygomatic process. So this is part of the bone that comes out right here, and you can feel it. If you put your finger on your ear and move anteriorly, you can feel like a little bridge of bone that comes here and then goes under your eye. The lateral portion of that is part of your temporal bone, and then it articulates with the bones, your facial bones here. We'll talk about that, but you can feel this zygomatic process. The styloid process, you can't feel, it's internal. But it's this long skinny bit that comes down. It comes from the same word for pen or stake, and it forms an important attachment point for some of your muscles of your neck. And I mentioned this mastoid process earlier. That actually forms an important attachment point for muscles of the neck as well, and also interestingly includes some air sinuses. And so we see these protuberances. If we see protuberances on bone, they're almost always associated with attachment points for muscles or ligaments. And do I have this feature here? Yep, you should know all of these parts of the temporal bone as well. One other thing I forgot. We have a fossa here. The mandibular fossa is this area right here. This is a smooth area. This is where your mandible articulates. So this is this joint right here. So if you clench your jaw, you feel that tension right there. That is a synovial joint we talked about with being really flexible. You can open and close your jaw laterally. That is a joint between your mandible and your temporal bone. And you have this feature in the temporal bone called the mandibular fossa, where this little condyle of your mandible articulates with your skull. Next, we have the sphenoid bone, and I think I'm going to stop here in favor of wrapping up. So we'll leave it. We talked about occipital and temporal bone today. We'll pick it up with the sphenoid bone on Monday. Just a couple other announcements here. I'm going to zip through the facial bones. You do have a class program for Monday. Be sure to check it out. It includes I got some feedback from some students, and I was thinking the exact same thing, that actually having your lab guide in advance of lab would be really helpful, so you can read it and know what's going on in lab beforehand and provide some background information. So I have that posted. It's actually available right now in Visible Body. So between now and Tuesday, please take time to read through that. We'll be dissecting the upper limbs of your calves and looking at the musculature there. I also have some readings associated with the skull for Monday too. So make sure you check out your class program for Monday. With that in mind, that is going to be your last class program until Wednesday, the 26th of October. So for me, fall break should be a break. You won't have any assignments over fall break. I don't have a study or a lab class program for you, no readings or anything like that. So as long as you're up on your classwork, you should have a nice chunk of time to not worry about human anatomy. I really think that we all need a fall break, which is why it's a break. And I encourage you to use that time to get caught up if you need to. But if you're caught up, then let your brain do something else for a little bit. And your Friday Venn diagram, that's all I got. Let me know if you have questions, and I will look forward to seeing all of you in class on Monday. It's a real cheerful Venn diagram for today. I should have saved this one for Halloween, maybe.